Basically, my worst nightmare happened, and all of the footage that I recorded yesterday no longer exists. I think maybe the universe was conspiring to have me do this segment 85 times and just be dedicated to its completion.
It's been 84 years.
So, thanks for coming along my wild ride with me. And let's get into this first segment of Conspiracy Corner.
MCC, CNN has just reported a light aircraft has hit the World Trade Center.
2 aircraft hit the World Trade Center.
So we're talking about 9/11. It's a heavy topic, and for good reason. A lot of lives were changed as we knew it back then. I was in 5th grade, and I remember exactly where I was. I was at school when I found out. My parents used to work in IT. My mom still does. And it had a really profound impact on our life. The whole company that they had started from the ground up wiped out in one terror attack. And our lives as a family changed. But there were lives that were more transformed than mine. At least I didn't lose my parents in that event. Now as an adult, as I look back on that event, there's way more that I question about the story that the general public was told as it pertains to 9/11. To start, I'll just outline a couple. Trillions of dollars of missing funds. The portion of the Pentagon that was hit also involved significantly in accounting, probably for the same funds that were missing. Lack of extemporaneous debris from the Pentagon attack in terms of finding remnants of the plane. Questions about the hijackers themselves. Who flew the planes? Because potentially there are accounts that indicate the hijackers weren't as skilled at flying as we were led to believe in our traumatized state right after seeing this happen, right after seeing planes crash into the tower. There have been metallurgic studies done that indicate potential use of incendiary devices to take down the buildings. A host of other weird coinkydinks in terms of who was connected to operations in the World Trade Center. I think there are some folks who might think it's insensitive to do a Conspiracy Corner episode on 9/11. But the real reason we should be doing a Conspiracy Corner episode of 9/11 is because there are so many questions that are still pending, given the amount of lives lost, and given the story that we were told by those who were in charge. So, I guess we'll start with the missing money and work our way forwards into the labyrinth of unknowns regarding September 11th, 2001.
Let's get started, shall we?
My journey into this conspiracy started with watching Joe Rogan. A lot of people watch Joe Rogan. But I tried to backtrack and find more evidence so that I could make my own conclusions. And I hope that during the course of this Conspiracy Corner, you guys can kind of take what I'm saying with a grain of salt if you want, and look into it for yourselves. Because my goal on Mythic Connections Unleashed is not to tell you what to think or how to think it. I just want you to ask more questions and begin to make more well-rounded assessments of the stories that were being told. So the day before the 9/11 attacks, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announces that there are $2.3 trillion in transactions that they can't account for.
That's a lot of money walking out of the door.
Like the money just grew legs and walked away, like some magician dressed as Uncle Sam pulled a rabbit out of a hat, and simultaneously made all this money disappear.
Is an illusion, a magic trick.
$2.3 trillion is enough to pay off all my student loans, start a new village in Africa, or maybe even a new nation, buy a homeless shelter, and take care of the homeless. Like, there's so many good things we could do with that, while, I could also have a monopoly mansion and not be in debt. And you're telling me all of this just walked away. No questions asked, like, oh, no big deal. I actually went back and found the C-SPAN briefing, so I'll link that below, and you guys to take a look at it for yourselves, along with the Joe Rogan clip that got me started down this whole rabbit hole of September 11th that really doesn't make sense if you look more into detail on a lot of these nuances that they try to tell you. So first, we have missing money. Now, I'd like to highlight that the VP at the time, Dick Cheney, did have connections to Halliburton, which is known as being a little bit tied to the military-industrial complex. Halliburton themselves were making billions of dollars in no-bid contracts with the government at the time. So, missing funds and money, just notably being made by the VP.
Dick Cheney a little bit low and outside.
Because of his association with Halliburton. I mean, we'll get into the warfighting aspect of this whole attack later. So let me just piece it together for you. Give me a minute. So we have the missing funds. The next day, on September 11th, the World Trade Centers are attacked, and so is the Pentagon. But first responders and eyewitnesses give accounts that there are secondary explosions, which means potentially bombs.
It's a bomb, isn't it?
These explosions had nothing to do with the airplane hitting the building. Pretty sure it also wasn't the jet fuel. They were just described completely different in separate locations as secondary explosions. For example, firefighters, other first responders, witnesses, people who were in the lobby and the basement reported these explosions, and some of them even described it like a bomb was going off. That's a little fishy, considering the general story that we're encouraged to believe is that the plane sent the towers tumbling down like Humpty Dumpty.
You expect me to believe that?
I'm hoping.
But there's more evidence that leads me to believe that there were definitely secondary explosions. A lot of secondary explosions. Secondary explosions created by incendiary devices. Military grade, capable of cutting through steel. The steel beams that held the World Trade Center up, despite being hit by multi-engine aircrafts.
Just think about it for a second, would you?
Somebody did this.
Not to mention, just for a second, for me to go on a tangent, building number 7 during 9/11 was never hit by a plane. It stood on fire for, I think, more than 5 hours, and then all of a sudden took a little tumble.
I assume demolition and then new construction.
Oh, I think it has character.
I don't think that was the debris from the attack, like hitting the building, and then all of a sudden it was like, hey! No. Open your eyes. But let's just take a look at geological surveys, metallurgic surveys that were taken to test the debris from the site, which in itself, the testing of the debris was limited. And they had different contractors segregated into zones, so no one at any point had a full view into all of the debris, how it fell, the composition. Different contractors took away different sets of debris. That debris was shipped overseas. What a coinky dink! Let's move all of the evidence and just take it out of the country.
They destroy the evidence before we even walk through the door.
Not fishy at all. So, missing funds, secondary explosions, and evidence removal. So, there's a geologic survey that indicates there's evidence of molten iron microspheres in the debris. Now, I don't even know how they got their hands on this because they were so fast to try to get rid of the evidence. But apparently, there were 4 tons of them. 4 tons of molten iron microspheres, about the diameter of a human hair.
Superheated hyperfluid of molten iron.
Where did all of this come from? Because I thought that the buildings were made of steel. Interesting. If you get further into it, iron has a melting point of 2800 degrees. So it would have had to have been at least 2800 degrees for these molten iron spheres to have the components melted and turn into a sphere. Also, what was the actual significance of those iron microspheres being present? Because if you look at it at surface value, you're just thinking those are like random compounds that they found in the rubble, but it's really not. It's really not. Let's take a look at the notes. Just for the sake of edification, iron's melting point is 2800 degrees. A regular fire would normally burn between 5 and 1400 degrees. We have a really large variance of about, I don't know, an extra 1400 degrees in terms of how hot this fire was burning, that it would have melted iron into microspheres. So, in a FEMA metallurgic survey, or like part of their metallurgic examination, you can find this in Appendix C from their publication in 2002. It specifically states that liquid molten iron was found invading steel, the steel beams that made up the World Trade Centers. Interesting. So technically, you can make the inference that liquid molten iron actually caused the steel to break and fall and come tumbling down like Humpty Dumpty. There's an additional evidence point that really makes you go, certainly makes me go, It's a peer-reviewed study in which they got samples, a few of them, and in those samples, what they found actually was undetonated nanothermite, a military incendiary compound.
Right, you have some demolition, don't you?
Now, we've done demolition before the war.
Looks kind of like red paint chips. And the interesting thing is when the components of this nanothermite, iron and aluminum, are ignited, they create molten iron microspheres. Apparently, in this event, they had so much iron and aluminum thermite compound that they created 4 tons of microspheres. So, this really calls into question how the buildings fell and why. I don't believe anymore that they fell because planes hit them and because potentially jet fuel came tumbling down elevator shafts. It has nothing to do with that. What it has to do with is thermite. And somebody had to have placed that thermite there in the buildings for there to be any kind of detonation. Which really makes you wonder who else was involved and how long were they planning this? Because there's no way you would think that they'd just be able to take a bunch of thermite in the World Trade Centers without anyone noticing.
And I suppose that's completely inconspicuous.
But that's okay. There's more evidence that other folks were involved in orchestrating something on the world stage, at least in this event. I watch a lot of this show called Redacted. There's someone they interviewed recently who believes that the planes may not have been steered into the World Trade Center by hijackers. Instead, their theory indicates that it's possible those planes could have been controlled by something called uninterruptible autopilot. The person they interviewed is Captain Dan Hanley, and he's the director of 9/11 pilot whistleblowers. There's a website called 911pilots.org, and he's available on X apparently, so I would be super interested to just reach out to him directly and just like talk to him. But he argues that it was possible that uninterruptible autopilot is really what caused those planes to crash. So when you take that into consideration, along with the components of thermite and the residual impact of thermite in terms of finding all those molten iron spheres, that really makes me think it's possible that someone else was involved here. That the story we were told in public was not the story that those who orchestrated this event really knew to be the truth. Because the truth was something else altogether. Let's get further into the uninterruptible autopilot theories and evidence that supports it. Captain Dan said a lot of interesting stuff. He's an ex-military pilot, but he's also a 30-year veteran from United, which is interesting for those of you who know me and where I work. So, apparently no pilots were allowed to testify for the 9/11 Commission report. Interesting that they wouldn't get their insight into how those planes made contact with the building and how all of the events went down. And he believes, actually, that the flights were electronically hijacked. If you look at Wikipedia, they actually have a page about Boeing Honeywell uninterruptible autopilot. And on that page, it talks about how this mechanism was created to prevent terrorists from taking control of the aircraft. When you first hear about it, maybe you're like, oh, well, it's possible they didn't have that technology at the time of 9/11 in 2001. That's not true. They started working on technology to orchestrate this as far back as the 1940s, at the end of World War II. The technology goes back to 1944, in which Captain Hanley describes that at the end of World War II, the US launched Operation Aphrodite, and they loaded a bunch of Army B-17s with incendiary compound. Once airborne, they remotely guided those aircraft to target. In 1944, before I was born, because I'm a 90s baby. An early 90s baby, but 90s nonetheless. And then they repeated it again more recently, so you can't say it was just Operation Aphrodite. In 1984, NASA and the FAA did a joint crash test experiment at a remote location and used a Boeing 720 commercial jet. They flew it via remote control several times around the pattern and then crash landed it. So they had a practice round for something similar to this event in 1984, after orchestrating a first go-around in 1944. And those are only the unclassified documentations of this occurrence. So you can imagine what the military is capable of doing off the record.
You're just starting to scratch the surface.
And out of the sight of the general public. I mean, they have black budgets too. Maybe some of it went to this. In any case, aside from the technology for it being there and potentially being present for the co-option of some party's interests, and I don't know who this would have been, but we can get more into it. Captain Dan argues that the hijackers themselves actually weren't qualified to perform the maneuvers that would have been required to orchestrate 9/11 on the whole. And he specifically references hijacker Hani Hanjour, who was responsible, allegedly, for American Airlines Flight 77 crashing into the Pentagon.
One eternity later.
So in order to understand the nuance of the Hani Hanjour story, you have to understand what happened in terms of how Flight 77 operated. And I'm going to read from my notes so I don't miss anything. American Airlines Flight 77 flew into the Pentagon by executing a 330-degree corkscrew turn from 7,000 feet west of the Pentagon to arrive precisely at ground level without striking the surface. To hit the office, or like offices, belonging to naval intelligence at 500 miles per hour on the first attempt.
Impressive work at the Pentagon.
Yes, it was.
I just want you to think about how complex that is. 360 is a full circle. So he went 330 degrees into a corkscrew at 500 miles per hour in a multi-engine aircraft, allegedly, and hit some very precise offices in the Pentagon. I'm already questioning the legitimacy here, even for a seasoned pilot. Captain Dan references a few things that call the Hani Hanjour story into question because he's supposed to be the pilot of this aircraft that executed this maneuver. There were several attempts in simulators by seasoned pilots to recreate those conditions and achieve the same result. Those pilots weren't able to do it. They crashed into the ground because that's a highly complex maneuver executed at a very high speed. In fact, in the interview, Captain Dan notes that he spoke to fighter pilots about this because they would have had to go through a very rigorous training to make it to the point where they could fly a fighter jet. Those people stated to Captain Dan that it would be difficult to pull off this maneuver even for them, especially on a first attempt. You might need practice for that bad boy. And this is no joke. Lives were lost, but again, it's another thing that makes you call into question the legitimacy of the story that we're told in light of how many lives were lost. It gets deeper about Hani Hanjour in terms of his own flight record and qualifications as well. Captain Dan believed in this interview that there might have been a cover-up executed by the FBI, the 9/11 Commission, and the FAA, which is absolutely insane. So, Hani Hanjour's background is that he was a 29-year-old Saudi hijacker who came to the US in the mid-90s for flight training. He attempted actually to re-enroll in some kind of flight training just prior to 9/11. That school tried to evaluate him based on his existing skill set and said that he couldn't even fly a Tonka truck with wings with his hands. Like, shoo! They said he was unfit. He was unfit for duty for a Cessna. Just keep that in mind as I go through the rest of this story. So, this man who was deemed unfit for flight school attempts in Maryland to rent an aircraft 1 month prior to 9/11. Because these folks that he attempted to rent from are not familiar with him or his background, they take him up on evaluation flights. So these were executed along with Sheila Baxter and Ben Connor. Sheila and Ben both said this dude need to stay on the ground.
His little brother said, "Tim, you can't fly.
I need a pilot.
So now you have a hijacker who allegedly flew at 500 miles an hour into the Pentagon after executing a 330-degree corkscrew with precision. But prior to this event, he was told that he has no business even attempting to rent a Cessna aircraft.
Do you expect me to believe that?
Now keep in mind, the Cessna versus a 757 is about a 100-ton difference. A multi-engine rating takes many more flight hours, much more complex training. How could this person have flown this aircraft from American Airlines into the Pentagon? I'm still questioning. So allegedly, Hani Hanjour got declined for the initial 2 evaluations to rent a Cessna. So he goes to seek out a third opinion. The third opinion apparently comes from someone named Eddie Shalev.
See, Eddie, what you don't know is that for the last 15 years, I've been studying Tai Chi.
Eddie Shalev came into the US about 2 months prior to the attack, and he's got some kind of IDF affiliation. Interesting. Now, I will say that most Israelis do have to serve in the IDF, so maybe this was nothing. However, Eddie Shalev, after Hani was turned away 3 times by other people, said, "Oh yeah, he's fine. You can let him go up. It's okay. He can fly."
I can fly. I can fly.
Even though 3 other entities said that he probably shouldn't, and that he didn't have the skill set required.
People said you can't fly a kite in a rainstorm.
Anybody else think that's fishy? Especially if you throw in the context of the political linkages that could have existed with Eddie. So, when the 9/11 Commission comes around to investigate, Ben Connor, one of the people who did the evaluation flight with this terrorist, allegedly, was expecting a phone call. He never received one. Do you know who received one? Eddie Shalev. And he's the only one noted. So the other people who evaluated this person and said that he was unfit to fly, somehow their testimonies were not included in the commission's investigation and reporting. And even Eddie's follow-up is just like a little footnote, apparently.
So don't you think that's fishy?
So, how do we come to the conclusion that this man really flew the plane?
I want to know about any aircraft that they deem suspicious.
Now, I know there's no official confirmation that the uninterruptible autopilot was used in this attack. Of course, no one would openly admit to it, but it is strange, given the missing funds, given the thermite, given everything else that could have been orchestrated as part of a really well-crafted story. I have to question the legitimacy of Hani's as well. And you also have to think about what would the US or what would military contractors have to gain by selling a story of Islamic terrorists creating a huge world upending terrorist attack in our country.
Only the military-industrial complex could afford to build something this size.
This attack was used for justification of a lot of things. The expansion of our military, in part, going to war in Iraq, along with made-up weapons of mass destruction. And I'm not saying all of these people were saints. What if military contractors like Halliburton would have stood to gain by creating an incentive to go to war. War with anyone who's associated with Islam. Again, I'm not claiming to have official expert insight because I'm just an independent researcher. But when you put everything together, this seems staged. And it seems like a lot of lives were sacrificed for the gain of a very few. But there are more fun facts, maybe not so fun facts, that would allude to this story as well in terms of this overarching 9/11 conspiracy. I think perhaps if someone was planning this, they were planning this for quite some time. Let's go over a few of those interesting tidbits that I found that kind of contribute to this story about the truth of 9/11 not being aligned with the story that was crafted. So Marvin P. Bush, George Bush's brother, was the director of something called Securicom. His brother and Securicom were responsible for electronic security for the World Trade Center as well as Dulles Airport, both connected with 9/11's events. They actually had an $8.3 million contract between the early 90s up until 2000, and they installed new security systems in those locations. Later on, the CEO of Securicom from 1999 up until 2002 was listed as George W.'s cousin, Wirt D. Walker III.
What is this, a family affair? Why is everybody here?
But it gets better than this, folks. And by better, I mean absolutely terrible in terms of the implications that could be inferred. So, IT specialist Scott Forbes was linked to a leased space in the South Tower. Apparently, 3 weeks before the attack, the Port Authority notified him that there was going to be a power down the weekend just prior to 9/11. This was unprecedented. They only had 3 weeks to make adjustments and arrangements to a lot of financial servers. So that weekend, the power goes down. And in that time frame, there's no regular security. There's no video cameras. All of the people were just kind of coming in and out of the World Trade Center. And in that time, he, along with others, witnessed people in uniforms like workmen carrying around unlabeled, suspicious boxes and cables, which could have been linked, potentially, to thermite being set, is the implication there. So we have unspecified workmen just, showing up in the nick of time during this power off conduction. Now, I don't know how long it would have taken to install thermite charges. I'm not an explosives or demolitions expert. But again, when you hear the whole story and put all of those nuances together in conjunction, it's pretty weird. And the implications are really messed up. Alright, so that's the end of the episode. What do you guys think about all of the weird details on the 9/11 conspiracy? It's one of the things that when I first discovered what could have been going on, I was really disturbed. And I was really sad because no one wants to think that you grow up in a country that could have planned that and sacrificed their own people. Nobody wants to lose family members Nobody wants to lose their way of life. Change is hard for people. It's even harder when war is at stake. And in reality, 9/11 changed the whole landscape of US security, US warfighting. There's a lot that stemmed after 9/11 even that I don't know that I feel it was justified. As citizens, we can vote and elect folks. The election is coming up. It's learning about cases like these that make me almost feel like it doesn't matter who you vote for. There's somebody else or other people who have influence on our government, on the decisions that are made, that have more sway than any of us do, even together, even with the Electoral College. Those who are in power have many ways around those things, many ways to rig things, many ways to influence us, because they know that we are more susceptible to believe particular stories when they're framed within particular contexts. Now again, this isn't even speaking to my personal political ideology, but folks are hiring influencers to come out and support various sides. There's so many illegitimate things said during debates, and people go back and fact check. The news, is even skewed on both sides. So, how do you find the truth in light of all that? How do we find the truth that's been obscured from 23 years ago? I don't know that I have all of the answers. All that I have is my desire to learn. And again, what I want to encourage you all to do by having Conspiracy Corner is to create a safe place for us to ask questions like this. Because I know good and well a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about controversial issues or things that may seem weird. But it's important that we talk about this stuff because not everything is just weird and made up. Some of this stuff is actually going on right under our noses. And the people who are organizing it rely on us to say that's unbelievable or that's a conspiracy theory or to just write it off so that they can keep doing what they're doing. So anyway, that's it from me. I appreciate all of you being along on this wild ride with me. And thanks for listening to Conspiracy Corner on Mythic Connections Unleashed. Bye!